All right, so we're diving into Jamaican politics today.
Okay. And specifically, this controversy brewing over the Director of Public Prosecutions,
Right.
the DPP, and then their salary.
Yeah, yeah.
It's a juicy one, especially with this whole data privacy angle. So, for those listening, you're trying to figure out why the Public Services Commission, that's the PSC, is keeping the DPP's salary under wraps.
Okay.
They're saying it's personal data protected by that 2020 Data Protection Act, but lots of folks are calling them out, saying the public deserves to know, especially about how public money's being used.
Mm-hmm.
And you know what? They've got a point.
Yeah.
To help us break it all down, we've got our expert on all things data protection and government transparency.
Happy to be here.
Let's start basic. For those of us who aren't fluent in Jamaican legal jargon, what does the DPP actually do?
Okay, so picture the DPP as like the gatekeeper of Jamaica's justice system.
Okay.
They decide which cases actually make it to court,
Right.
what charges are brought. It's a powerful position.
Yeah.
They decide who gets prosecuted.
Yeah.
The Governor General appoints them directly. That's how important it is.
So I can see why people are a tad curious about the paycheck for that kind of influence.
Right.
Especially if it's taxpayer money funding it, right? It's an accountability thing.
Absolutely. Transparency in government is crucial, and that often means being open about how public funds are used, including the salaries of key positions.
Which brings us back to the PSC using this Data Protection Act as a shield.
Exactly.
But is that really what it's for? I'll admit, Data Protection Act always makes my eyes glaze over a bit. Can you give it to us plain and simple? What's the act all about?
I get it. These laws can be dense. Basically, Jamaica's 2020 Data Protection Act is there to protect citizens' personal info names, addresses, financial details from being misused or accessed without the right authorization.
Right.
It's about giving individuals more control.
Okay, sounds good on paper, but I'm guessing the devil's in the details, yeah.
Yeah.
How do you define personal data, especially for public officials? Where's the line?
You hit the nail on the head. The Act defines it as any info about a living person that can identify them directly or indirectly.
Okay.
So you could argue a salary tied to a person fits that.
So the PSC is not totally wrong in saying a salary falls under that umbrella.
Right.
But it can't be that simple. We're talking about a public official's salary, not someone's personal bank account.
You're right. There has to be a distinction.
Right.
And that's where fairness and lawfulness come in. The Act isn't meant to be a blanket ban on sharing any information that could be personal.
All right.
It says processing that data has to be fair, lawful, thinking of the individual's rights, but also the public's right to know.
So it's not just if the DPC's salary counts as personal data, but if withholding it is actually fair and legal, considering their very public job.
Exactly.
And this is where it gets interesting.
Yeah.
The Act even has exemptions.
Yes.
And the PSC is really leaning on one tied to judicial appointments to justify this whole thing.
It looks that way.
This is getting good.
Great.
Let's dig into those exemptions when we come back for Act 2 of our deep dive. All right, so we're back on the case of this DPP salary mystery. Before the break, we were getting into those exemptions in Jamaica's Data Protection Act,
Right. Okay.
the ones the PSC is using as a defense.
Yes.
What's the deal with these exemptions? How do they connect to the DPP salary specifically?
Well, that article you shared points out the PSC is leaning on a specific part of the Act,
Mm-hmm.
the part dealing with judicial appointments.
Okay.
Seems like they're arguing that because the DPP's salary is tied to how much a puny judge makes, which is public, revealing the DPP's pay could somehow put the whole judicial appointment process at risk.
Hold up, puny judge. Some of us didn't go to law school. What is that exactly?
Oh, good point. Not a term you hear every day. In Jamaica, a puny judge is basically a high court judge.
Got it. Thanks for clearing that up. But even so, the PSC's logic still seems flimsy. They're saying that revealing the DPP's salary, which we know is linked to a public figure already, would suddenly threaten how judges are appointed. Seriously.
It's a bit of a stretch.
Yeah.
And this is where another part of the Act comes into play, Section 6. It allows for some info to be kept private if releasing it could compromise other confidential data.
Oh.
However, as the article points out, salary info, especially for public officials paid by taxpayers, has a strong claim to transparency.
Exactly. It's tough to imagine how the DPP salary, which we know is tied to a publicly available number anyway, would suddenly create this huge risk for judicial appointments just by being public.
Yeah, it does seem like they're trying to fit a square peg in a round hole.
Totally.
What's interesting is this isn't the first time Jamaica's run into this conflict between data protection and the public's right to know.
Really?
Yeah, the article mentioned a past case with the tax administration in Jamaica, the TJ.
Oh, right. Tell me more about that. What happened with the TJ?
So the media wanted information on the owners of properties the government was leasing.
Huh?
They wanted to know who was benefiting from these government contracts.
Makes sense.
Seems reasonable, right?
Yeah, totally.
Well, initially the TIJ refused.
Really?
They actually cited the Data Protection Act, said revealing those owners would be a breach of privacy.
Hold on. So the government's leasing out properties, presumably using taxpayer money,
Right.
and the public wasn't allowed to know who these landlords were? Something about that feels off.
Yeah, that was a general feeling at the time. Huge public outcry. People were saying taxpayers have a right to know where their money's going, who's profiting from these government deals.
Right.
It became a whole debate about whether the TIJ was just using the Data Protection Act to hide behind and avoid being transparent about government spending.
So what happened? Did the public ever find out who those property owners were?
It took a while and a good amount of public pressure. But yeah, the TJ eventually gave in and released some of the info.
Hmm.
But the whole thing really highlighted this gray area in Jamaica's data protection laws, especially when it comes to balancing individual privacy with the public's right to know how government money is being used.
Definitely echoes the current situation with the DPP's salary. Do you think there's a pattern here of potentially misusing this data protection law?
It's a valid concern for sure. This case really shows how complex it is to implement new data protection legislation.
Hmm.
It often takes these real-world situations, public scrutiny, even legal challenges, to clarify the finer points and find that balance between protecting individual rights and making sure the government is transparent.
So, bringing it back to the DPP, are we seeing the Data Protection Act being used as a shield again? Is it just interpretation, or is there something more deliberate going on here?
Tough to say for sure without really getting into the PSC's heads,
Right.
but the fact that the Act itself has these nuances
Yeah.
with things like Section 6, which allows for limited disclosure in specific situations, it does raise questions about how the PSC is choosing to interpret and apply the law.
Yeah, it's like they're picking and choosing which parts they want to emphasize depending on what outcome they want?
Exactly. And that's why the Information Commissioner's role is so interesting here. They're the ones supposed to make sure the Data Protection Act is applied fairly and consistently in every situation.
Right. The article mentioned them kind of like a data protection watchdog. Could they be the key to getting some actual transparency with this DPP salary situation?
This feels like a good place to pick things up in the final act of our deep dive. All right, we're back for the final act of our deep dive into this whole Jamaican politics and data protection puzzle. Before the break, we were talking about the Information Commissioner
Right.
and their role as like the data protection referee in all of this.
Exactly.
So do they actually have the power to step in and clear up this DPP salary mess?
Oh, they definitely do. The Information Commissioner is not just for show. They can investigate complaints, issue warnings, even take legal action if someone's misusing personal data.
Wow, for real. So they can basically tell the PSC to cough up the DPP salary details.
It's not quite that straightforward, but essentially, yeah. Anyone can file a complaint with the Information Commissioner if they think an organization's hiding behind the Data Protection Act.
Okay.
And the commissioner can investigate whether that's actually legit.
So if enough people make a fuss about this whole DPP salary secrecy, the Information Commissioner might actually do something.
Exactly. They've been pretty clear, especially after that whole TAJ property situation, that the Data Protection Act isn't meant to be a way to dodge accountability and hide information that the public deserves to know.
Well, that's a relief. So there might be some transparency in our future after all.
Let's hope so.
But, there's still something about the PSC's argument that just doesn't sit right with me.
Yeah.
We already know the DPP's salary is directly linked to what a PZ judge makes.
Right.
And that information is public.
It is.
So doesn't that kind of undermine their whole privacy argument?
It's a good point. And it really highlights the challenges we face with balancing individual privacy and the public's right to know, especially when we're talking about people in positions of power. Right. These public figures, they give up a certain degree of privacy just by taking on these roles. Their actions are under public scrutiny, and their salaries, often paid for by taxpayers, are naturally part of that transparency.
It does make sense that the public should know how their tax dollars are being used, especially for something like government salaries.
Absolutely.
But I imagine it's never just black and white, is it?
You're right, it never is. Public officials, even the high-profile ones, are still entitled to some privacy. The
Yeah.
tricky part is figuring out where that line is. When does the public's right to know outweigh an individual's right to privacy, especially when it comes to their finances? That's the million-dollar question.
Isn't it, though? And I bet the answer changes depending on the situation.
Exactly. That's what makes these cases so fascinating. They make us really think about data protection, about government transparency, about finding that balance between these competing interests.
It's like finding that sweet spot on a Venn diagram where data protection and public interest overlap.
I like that. It's not always about picking one or the other, but finding ways to make them both work, even when they seem to be at odds.
Well, this deep dive has certainly given us a lot to chew on. We started with a simple question about a salary and ended up exploring data protection laws, government accountability, the whole shebang.
It's all connected, though.
It really is. We've been talking about Jamaica, but this is a global issue, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
As more and more data is collected, stored, potentially used, finding that balance between protecting privacy and ensuring transparency is only going to get more complicated.
It's like this whole situation in Jamaica is a sneak peek into the future of this debate everywhere.
In a way, yeah.
Well, as we resurface from this information-packed deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with something to ponder. How can Jamaica, and honestly, how can we all, refine our approach to data protection so we're not constantly battling between privacy and transparency? Should there be clearer guidelines, especially when it comes to public officials and their salaries? It's something we all need to consider as we navigate this ever-evolving digital world. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.